And to my wife's wonderful parents, thank you for being the family I always dreamed of. The words, spoken by my son, Leo, sliced through the crystal-clinking cheer of the reception hall. They were meant to sound noble, a tribute to his new, wealthy in-laws. But I, standing near the service entrance, hidden behind a potted fern, heard the blade in them. I felt the cut. Every brick of this opulent venue, every petal in the extravagant floral arrangements, every bubble in the champagne they toasted with it, was all paid for by my hands. Hands that were raw and chapped from scrubbing other people's floors. Hands that smelled of bleach and ammonia for 30 years so his could smell of expensive cologne. I looked at the calluses on my palms, the roadmap of my sacrifice, and felt a cold, hard fury solidify in my chest. He wasn't just thanking them, he was erasing me. He was using the sweat of my immigrant life to wash away the shame of having me as his mother. The polite applause swelled, a wave of sound that threatened to drown me, and in that moment, something inside me broke. The years of quiet endurance, of biting my tongue, of accepting the casual cruelties disguised as jokes, all shattered. Then, just as Leo raised his glass, the smooth voice of the wedding DJ cut through the air. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a brief interruption for a very special presentation. A massive screen, previously hidden above the band, descended from the ceiling, glowing with a bright, empty blue. Every head turned towards it. I saw Leo's face, a mask of confusion. His new wife Tiffany whispered something in his ear. My heart hammered against my ribs, a wild drumbeat of fear, and something else, something terrifyingly new: power. Why was the DJ looking directly at me? What had I done? I went home after that conversation and sat in my armchair for hours, the unsigned loan papers for the final wedding payment on the table beside me. The silence in my small house was deafening. It was a hollowness in my chest, a cold so deep I thought my heart had frozen solid. This wasn't just disrespect, it was an erasure. My son, my mijo, for whom I had sacrificed everything, had just told me that my very existence was an embarrassment. The pain was a physical thing, a weight pressing down on me until I could barely breathe. I saw my entire life as a mother as a failure, a long road of back-breaking work that had led to this single, devastating moment of rejection. The room was a museum of that failure. Every scuff on the hardwood floor was from his cleats as he practiced soccer inside on rainy days. The faint, greasy mark on the ceiling above the stove was from the year he'd been obsessed with frying plantains, and I'd stood beside him, teaching him how to know they were perfectly golden. The worn-out spot on the armrest of this very chair was where his small, feverish head had rested through so many childhood illnesses. I had polished every memory until it shone, but now I saw them for what they were: ghosts. He had moved on, and in doing so, he had declared our shared past null and void. My eyes fell on a framed photograph on the bookshelf. It was of the two of us at Coney Island, taken when he was 7. His small body was plastered to my side, a half-eaten cotton candy in one hand, the other gripping my shirt as if I were the only solid thing in a spinning world. My hair was a wild mess from the wind, and I was laughing, a real, unguarded laugh that reached my eyes. I looked at that woman so strong, so sure of her place in her son's universe, and I didn't recognize her. She was a fool. A hot, sharp anger began to cut through the icy numbness. It started as a pinprick behind my eyes and spread through my veins like a fever. He didn't just want my money, he wanted my complicity. He wanted me to quietly fund my own humiliation, to pay for the gilded cage he was asking me to step into. Stay in the background. The words echoed, each one a tiny hammer on the anvil of my heart. He thought I would be uncomfortable. No, he was uncomfortable. He was ashamed. I thought of my own mother, Abuela Rosa, whose hands were more calloused than mine, whose accent was even thicker. She had sold her few pieces of jewelry to buy my ticket to this country, whispering, "Vas a darle una vida mejor a tu hijo, and you will give your son a better life." Had she ever imagined that this better life would mean her grandson would see her as something less? that he would trade her empanadas for canapes and her fierce, proud love for the brittle approval of strangers. I stood up, my joints protesting after hours of stillness. I walked to the kitchen and opened the refrigerator. There, on the middle shelf, sat the remaining empanadas from the platter I'd made for the engagement dinner. I took one out. The pastry was cold and tough now, the filling congealed. I held it in my palm, this little half-moon of my history, my mother's history. Rustic, Tiffany's mother had called it. I remembered the warmth of my mother's kitchen, the smell of cumin and sautéed onions, the sound of her humming as she rolled the dough. That woman with the stretched tight face would never know the love that was kneaded into this food, the stories baked into its crust. To her, it was a curious artifact. To Leo, it was an embarrassment. To me, it was everything, a clarity, cold and absolute, washed over me. This wasn't about love anymore. It was about a transaction. He had made it so. He had reduced 26 years of sacrifice to a line item in a budget and my presence to a logistical problem. I walked back to the living room and picked up the loan papers. The bank's logo was a sleek, soulless thing. I ran my thumb over the dotted line where my signature was supposed to go, where I was supposed to sign away the roof over my head to buy a son who no longer wanted me a single day of happiness. The weight in my chest shifted, melting from leaden grief into something harder, something unbreakable. I didn't tear the papers. I didn't scream or cry. I simply placed them back on the table, aligning the edges neatly. Then I picked up my phone. My hand was perfectly steady. I dialed his number. It rang 3 times before he answered, his voice bright, artificially casual. "Hey Mom, everything okay?" Leo, I said, and my voice did not shake. It was low, firm, and carried the faint, unapologetic music of my accent. "We need to talk about the wedding, and I will not be staying in the background. If you are ashamed of me, of where you come from, then that is a burden you will have to carry. But I will not pay for the privilege of being your secret. But she will not be a ghost in the corner, and she will not be your banker." I was just finally, blessedly, seeing the truth. And for the first time in a long time, I was not ashamed of what I saw. The numbness began to recede, replaced by a strange, humming energy. It started in my fingertips where they touched the brittle, yellowed paper of the ledger. A tiny current that traveled up my arms and settled deep in my chest, right where the hollowness had been. The solid resolve I'd felt after hanging up on my son was still there, but now it had a shape. It had a name, written in elegant, faded script across the ledger is a cover. Finanzas del Señor Alvaro 1982. I ran my thumb over the indentation of the numbers. I hadn't just been good, I had been an artist. Señor Alvaro was a bull of a man, all bluster and cigar smoke. But he was functionally illiterate when it came to the true language of power, the language of numbers. He could intimidate and charm. But he couldn't make a peso disappear and reappear as a legitimate donation to a senator's favorite charity. I could trace the flow of dirty money through a labyrinth of shell companies and offshore accounts, cleaning it until it shone with respectability. I was the architect of his legitimacy, the ghost in his machine. They called me La Calculadora, and the name was not given lightly. It was earned. It was feared. And I had buried her. I had packed her away in this little wooden box and crossed an ocean, trading ink-stained fingers for the raw, cracked hands of a woman who scrubbed other people's floors. I had done it for him, so he could have a clean start and untarnished name in this new country. The irony was so thick I could taste it, bitter and metallic on my tongue. In trying to erase the stains of my past, I had become a stain myself in his bright, shiny future. Something to be hidden, a piece of inconvenient history. A dry, soundless laugh escaped me. He thought he needed a loan from a bank. He had no idea. The knowledge in this box was worth more than any loan. It was a different kind of currency, one of secrets and precision, of seeing the hidden architecture of wealth. I lifted the ledger out, the weight of it, familiar and terrifying. Beneath it, nestled in the faded velvet lining, was the fountain pen, a Mont Blanc A gift from Senator Alvaro, after a particularly creative bit of accounting, had saved him from a federal inquiry. The black resin was cool and smooth, a sliver of obsidian in my palm. I unscrewed the cap. The 14-karat gold nib, untouched for over 20 years, gleamed in the lamplight like a wicked little smile. My son's words echoed in the silent room. Asterisk, stay in the background. Asterisk, he wanted his mother to be a passive spectator in the story of his life. But La Calcadora was never a spectator. She was a player. She moved numbers, and in moving numbers, she moved the world. I carried the ledger and the pen to my small kitchen table, pushing aside a pile of unopened bills. I opened the book to a fresh page. The paper was creamy and thick, thirsty for ink. I reached for a cheap ballpoint from a jar by the phone, but my hand stopped mid-air. No, that wouldn't do. Not for this. I found an old bottle of Schiefer Script Jet Black ink in the box. I uncorked it, the scent a dusty, chemical ghost from another life. I filled the reservoir of the Mont Blanc, the mechanism moving with a satisfying, fluid precision I had not forgotten. I wiped the nib clean. Then, I put the nib to the paper. It hesitated for a second, a tiny bead of black ink pooling on the surface, before it began to glide. It was like riding a bicycle. The muscle memory was still there, deep in my bones. My handwriting, a crisp, efficient cursive I hadn't used in decades, flowed onto the page. Asterisk assets, asterisk, I wrote at the top. I did not list my meager savings account or the fading equity in this small house. I listed my mind. Asterisk 30 years of experience in forensic-level accounting and financial obfuscation. Intimate knowledge of offshore banking protocols pre-2000. But principles remain. Fluent in the language of hidden wealth, asterisk, it sounded audacious, insane. But it was the truth. Under asterisk liabilities asterisk, I wrote a single line, asterisk a son who sees his mother as one. Asterisk, my phone, silent since our conversation, sat dark on the counter. He was probably with her, with his future in-laws, explaining how his difficult, dramatic mother was causing problems. They were likely reassuring him, telling him he was doing the right thing by setting boundaries. A slow, cold smile touched my lips. Let them have their moment. Let them think they had one, that I would quietly accept my assigned role as the faded photograph in the family album. I looked back at the ledger. The numbers and words I had written seemed to pulse with a quiet, latent power. I had spent a lifetime making myself smaller for my country, for my son, for this new land. I had compressed myself into the tiny, locked box of mother. I had spent my life building my son up, and he had used that strength to crush me. He and his new family saw me as a simple, uneducated old woman, a ghost. Fine. Ghosts can walk through walls. They see things no one else does. That night, I decided I would not be erased. I would not be a quiet, shameful secret in the back of the room. If my savings were going to pay for this wedding, I would be a guest of honor. And I would bring a gift they would never forget, the truth. Pre-2000 offshore banking protocols are not like they are in the movies. It wasn't just numbered accounts in Switzerland. It was a labyrinth of bearer-share corporations. Interlocking trusts in jurisdictions that no longer exist. And wire transfers that bounced from the Caymans to Liechtenstein via a shell company in Macau, all before the age of digital footprints. I didn't just know the labyrinth, I had helped design parts of it, for a government that needed certain financial operations to be traceable. I was the ghost in that machine, too. My first target was the father, Robert, a self-made man in commercial real estate. People like him always had a story, a foundational myth about their first big break. His was a lucky land purchase in the early 90s, just before a highway extension was announced. A story he loved to tell at dinner parties, his voice dripping with false modesty. It took me less than 4 hours, most of it spent waiting for the library's public terminals to free up. I didn't need sophisticated tools. I had the principles. public property records, archived local newspaper articles on microfiche, and corporate registrations. The trail was faint, but it was there. The land wasn't purchased by Robert directly. It was acquired by a holding company, Apex Land Ventures, which was dissolved 6 months after the profitable sale. The sole signatory on the Apex documents was a lawyer who had been disbarred 2 years later for fraud. And that lawyer had, for a brief 18-month period, shared an office address with a young city planner named, I cross-referenced the name, Arthur Higgins. The current mayor. It was a simple, elegant graft. Not a direct bribe, but a whispered tip, an opportunity placed in the path of an ambitious young man. The kind of thing that leaves no bank records, only a pattern, a ghost of a pattern. To anyone else, it was a series of disconnected facts. To me, it was an equation, and it balanced perfectly. Robert's entire empire was built on a single, well-placed insider tip. I wondered if his future son-in-law knew his family's fortune was seeded with corruption. I filed the information away. It was a good opening move. The mother, Eleanor, was next. Her veneer was one of cultured, old-money elegance. She chaired charity galas and spoke of her family's long history. A few deeper dives into social registry archives and genealogical databases, the kind that require a bit of creative searching to bypass paywalls, told a different story. Her old money was from a textile mill that had gone bankrupt in the 70s. The current wealth came from her second husband, Robert, but there was a first husband, a brief marriage expunged from the official family narrative. His name was David Chen. A few more searches pulling on the thread. David Chen was now a moderately successful importer based in San Francisco. There was no contact, no overlap. Except for one thing. A private foundation, listed in Eleanor's name, made an annual anonymous donation to a scholarship fund at a prestigious university. A scholarship that, for the last 15 years, had been awarded to a student named Michael Chen. Her son, the son she never mentioned, the one she had quietly paid to educate and, presumably, to stay out of her new, polished life. She had erased her first family to build her second. The hypocrisy was so thick, I could taste it. I worked through the night, the blue light of the screen, my only companion. The house was silent, a stark contrast to the roaring engine in my mind. I wasn't just gathering dirt. I was building a ledger. A new kind of balance sheet. On one side, their public personas, the respectable businessman, the philanthropic socialite, the bright-eyed young couple in love. On the other, the cold, hard assets of their deceptions. My son thought my skills were obsolete, relics of a bygone era. He saw my knowledge as a quaint, slightly embarrassing secret, like a tattoo from a rebellious youth. He didn't understand that the principles of hiding wealth are the same principles of uncovering it. You just run the math in reverse. You follow the silence. You look for the empty space where something should be, and you know that's where the truth is buried. As the first rays of dawn painted the sky, I leaned back in my chair. My body ached with fatigue, but my mind was sharper than it had been in 20 years. I had their secrets. I had the ammunition. But a public explosion would be messy, crude. It would alienate my son forever and paint me as the vindictive lunatic they already thought I was. No, I am like Oquadora. I do not deal in blunt force. I deal in precision. I would not reveal their secrets. I would make them live in fear of the revelation. I would become the ghost at their feast, the whisper in their ear, the unblinking eye that sees the hidden ledger behind their perfect lives. They wanted a simple, uneducated old woman to quietly pay the bill and fade away. They were about to learn that the quiet ones are the ones you have to watch, because while you're talking, we're listening. And while you're boasting, we're calculating. The sum of their lives was a negative integer, and I was about to present them with the bill. The pen felt heavy in my hand, a deliberate instrument of my surrender. I signed the loan papers with a flourish that belied the cold knot in my stomach. My signature, a perfect replica of the one I'd used for decades on grocery lists and birthday cards, utterly unremarkable. But before I handed the folder back to the slick, young banker, I made a copy of every single document, the mechanical whir and flash of the library's public copier, feeling like the cocking of a gun, delivering the final check to Robert, Tiffany's father and my son's business partner, was a study in theatrical humility. I held the envelope with both hands, my head slightly bowed, playing the part of the grateful, burden-lifted mother. He took it with a magnanimous smile, the kind reserved for children and simpletons. "I'm so glad we could help you get sorted, Maria," he said, his voice dripping with the paternalistic warmth that made my teeth ache. That's when I made my move. With the wedding so close, I began letting a flutter of nervous energy into my voice. "Your staff must be overwhelmed. Please, let me help. I may be old, but I can still polish silver until it shines." I offered a timid smile. It would make me feel useful. For the family. I was the silent, stooped figure in the corner, diligently rubbing a soft cloth over ornate tea sets and heavy candelabras. They spoke around me as if I weren't there. Discussing seating charts and champagne vintages, their voices a low, privileged hum. My invisibility was a cloak I wore with practiced ease. During a lull, when the house manager was distracted by a delivery of floral arrangements, I slipped into Robert's home office. The room smelled of leather and expensive cigar smoke, a temple of self-congratulation. My heart wasn't pounding with adrenaline, it was beating a slow, steady rhythm of purpose. I saw the legal notepad by his phone, the top sheet torn away. A simple, almost forgotten technique from my past surfaced in my mind. I took a pencil from the cup and, holding it almost parallel to the next sheet, began to shade lightly over the surface. Like ghosts rising from the paper, the impressions emerged. A series of numbers, written with the angry pressure of someone in a hurry. Account numbers. And next to them, a single, hastily scrawled word, Ethelred *. It wasn't a name I recognized from their corporate structure. It was a ghost, a secret. That night, and for many nights after, I went to the local library. The public computers became my command center. The young librarian, a kind woman with tired eyes, grew used to seeing me there, and I'd often ask for her help with this confounding machine, playing the part of a technologically illiterate grandmother. She'd show me how to open a new tab, her patience a shield for my true activities. While she thought I was struggling to check my email, I was diving deep. I pulled up their company's public filings, cross-referencing the numbers from the notepad with the labyrinth of their official financials. The patterns, once invisible, now glowed with damning clarity. I saw the inflated invoices paid to a vendor that didn't exist. The shell corporations with names like Ethelred Holdings that were nothing more than post office boxes in offshore havens. The ghost employees on the payroll who were, in reality, siphoning funds directly into Robert's and I's soon discovered my own son's pockets. It was amateur hour, clumsy. They were greedy, not clever. They left digital breadcrumbs where my old targets had left none. They thought the complexity of modern finance was a shield, but it was just a different kind of lock, and the principles of picking it remained the same. You follow the money until it disappears, and you know that's where the truth is buried. Leaning back in the hard plastic library chair, the blue glow of the monitor reflected in my glasses, I felt a grim smile touch my lips. They had taken my life's savings, my security, my dignity. They saw me as a fossil, a calculator whose batteries had died long ago. But they were wrong. I was not obsolete. Primera was la calculadora, and I had just finished running the final audit. The sum of their lies was a negative integer, a debt that stretched into the millions. And I was about to become their most persistent, most unexpected creditor. The wedding was no longer a celebration. It was the perfect venue for a reckoning. The plastic clock above the library's main desk ticked over to 5 p.m. The sound a dull, metallic thud in the hushed stillness. My back ached from hours spent in this unforgiving chair wars. I should have been cleaning houses, but I'd taken a leave of absence, trading my mop and bucket for a keyboard and this digital hunt. The lost income was a constant worry, but the pain in my spine was a grounding force, a necessary reminder of the physical reality of this mission. Javier, my contact inside their company, had been my ghost in the machine for 3 weeks now, and the data stream he provided was a fire hose of their carelessness. I had the what and the how from my own digging. Javier was giving me the when and the who. Tonight's encrypted file, delivered to a dead-drop email account I'd taught him to use, was different. It wasn't just data. It was a narrative. I opened it, the familiar rows and columns populating my screen. It was a log of all keycard swipes for the executive floor over the last 6 months, cross-rendered with after-hours remote logins to the primary financial server. The pattern was so blatant, it was almost insulting. Robert, my son-in-law-to-be, was a creature of habit, leaving promptly at 5 unless there was a client dinner. But the server logins showed user R Black accessing the books deep into the night, always from an IP address registered to a boutique hotel in the Cayman Islands. Amateur hour. Then I saw the other name, the one that made the lukewarm library coffee I'd been drinking curdle in my stomach. L. Cortés and Leon May? Son. His keycard swipes were less frequent, more erratic, but they consistently clustered in the 30 minutes asterisk after asterisk Robert's late-night digital forays, as if Robert would remotely plant the digital seeds of their fraud, the inflated invoices, the ghost employee payments, and then Alina would come in, physically, to print, to sign, to file the paper trail that gave the ghost a body. The muscle to Robert's brain, the accomplice, a memory unbidden and sharp, cut through the cold analysis. Leo, age 7, his small hand in mine as we walked to the corner store. He'd found a $20 bill on the pavement. Instead of pocketing it, his face had screwed up in worry. Mommy, someone lost this, they'll be sad. He'd insisted we take it to the store clerk, in case the owner came back. I had swelled with a pride so fierce it hurt. Where was that boy? Had Robert simply offered him a bigger 20, one so large it eclipsed his conscience? Javier's help went beyond data. Last Tuesday, a simple text. They are upgrading the office security system next week. New cameras, new motion sensors. A full audit of user permissions. It wasn't a warning for me, it was a statement of fact, but I understood its meaning. The window to act was closing. The digital locks were being changed. This forced my hand, accelerating a plan that was still half-formed. I needed more than documents. I needed a voice. I needed leverage that couldn't be deleted with a keystroke. I called Javier, using the cheap, prepaid phone I'd bought with cash from a dubious kiosk downtown. Javier, it's me, I said, my voice low, the words feeling foreign and dramatic. This new system, is there a way? Can you hear them? Providing logs was one thing, active real-time surveillance was another. It crossed a line from helpful informant to something else entirely. Senora, he finally said, his voice tight. For my father. For what you did. But this is the last thing. After this, we are square. My debt is paid. The label was chillingly mundane. Project Synergy kickoff meeting. My hand trembled slightly as I plugged in my headphones, the plastic ears feeling like lead weights. I clicked play. The first voice was Robert's, slick and confident, the same tone he used to explain the virtues of a particular champagne. So the Ethelred Holdings transfer is complete, clean. Alina, you'll handle the consultant fees from the Henderson account. Make sure the paperwork is creatively vague. It's almost cute. Problem solved? The library's quiet was no longer peaceful. It was the calm before the storm. They had given me everything I needed. The numbers from the notepad, the digital trails from Javier's logs, and now their own voices condemning themselves. They saw a dinosaur, a fossil, but a fossil is a record, a preserved memory of what once was. And I, La Calculadora, was the living record of their sins. The sum of their lies was indeed a negative integer, a debt of millions, but also of morality, of family, of a little boy who once returned a $20 bill. The wedding was in 11 days. They thought it was a beginning. I would make sure it was their end. I had the evidence. Now, I just needed the perfect moment to present the bill. My first move was subtle. Through my ally, leaked an anonymous tip to a financial blogger about a potential discrepancy in the company's quarterly earnings report. It was small, just enough to be noticed, but easily dismissed. The company's stock dipped slightly. I watched as Leo and his father-in-law laughed it off on a conference call, calling it the work of clueless amateur bloggers. They didn't even consider looking for a leak. Their arrogance was my greatest asset. That small, controlled tremor was just to test the foundations, to see if they'd even feel it. They hadn't. They were too busy building their gilded future on what they thought was solid ground. I, however, was working in the substrator, where the pressure was immense and the rock was about to fracture. My next move required a different kind of precision. The wedding, it was no longer just their target date for consolidation. It was now mine for demolition. Every detail of the extravagant affair was a potential lever. I started with the seating chart, which Tiffany had, with a dramatic sigh, emailed me for my thoughts. I opened the file, and a cold smile touched my lips. It was a masterpiece of social climbing and corporate sycophancy. Robert and his inner circle were at the prime table. Of course, along with the CEO of the firm they were secretly negotiating with for the merger. I studied the names, cross-referencing them with the shell companies Javier had helped me unearth. Then, I saw it. A small, seemingly insignificant detail. The place cards were to be made of seeded paper, embedded with wildflowers, so guests can plant them, and our love will grow. Alina had gushed during one of her few calls. It was nauseating, but it was also an opportunity. The company handling the place cards, Verdant Impressions, was a recent and rather large vendor payment from a subsidiary I had flagged. A payment for branded floral installations. The amount was exorbitant for pieces of paper that would be thrown away or, at best, buried in a garden. I picked up the phone and called the number listed on Verdant Impressions' website. I used the slightly quavery, older woman voice I had perfected for dealing with my son's office, just a confused mother tone. "Hello, dear," I said when a young woman answered. "I'm calling about the place cards for the Sterling Wright wedding. My son, Leo, is the groom. He's just so busy, the poor thing, and he asked me to confirm the final wording. He's so worried about the kerning, ma'am." The name wasn't on the original chart. He was the majority shareholder of the acquisition target. A man so reclusive the financial press called him the Ghost. Robert had him seated at the prime table at his own daughter's wedding. This wasn't a celebration, it was a closing dinner disguised with tulle and lilies. "And just to confirm, dear," I purred, "the invoice has been sent to the corporate office, correct? For the marketing department. My son-in-law is so forgetful with these things. They were laundering their wedding through their own fraud." I leaned back, the hum of my laptop a familiar comfort. The pieces were aligning with a beautiful, terrible symmetry. The blogger's tip was a pinprick, the place cards were a thread, and I had just pulled it. I opened a new, encrypted file and began to type, my fingers flying across the keyboard. I laid it all out, the voice recording, the digital ledger from Javier, the inflated invoices, the payments to Verdant Impressions, and a dozen other vendors that were just fronts, all flowing back to the wedding. I connected the dots between the shell companies and the guests on the seating chart. Between the marketing retreat in Vegas and the actual sordid details of my son's bachelor party that I'd pieced together from his friends' careless social media posts. I was no longer just LA calculadora adding up columns of numbers. I was the archivist, the cartographer of their ruin. I was drafting the final report, the one that would reduce their world to zero. The wedding was in 10 days. They were counting down to a triumph. I was counting down to a detonation, and I knew, with a certainty that felt as solid and ancient as bone, that when I presented my bill, the venue would be packed with every single person they had ever wanted to impress. Their reaction was exactly what I had hoped for. Believing they were untouchable, they grew bolder. To cover the small hole I had created and recoup their minor stock loss, they pushed through a large, fraudulent real estate transaction, moving a significant amount of embezzled money into an offshore account. My ally tracked the entire digital trail, capturing every keystroke and every transfer confirmation. They were so confident in their own genius that they became sloppy. The transaction was a thing of ugly, brute force greed. A property in the Catskills, a decaying lodge supposedly purchased by a silent partner for a corporate wellness retreat. The price was ludicrous, a number that would make a sane person laugh. The money, a thick, viscous river of cash, flowed from one of their primary shells. Through a newly formed LLC with a name so generic it was practically invisible, Summit Horizon Ventures, and then seem in a flurry of digital sleight of hand, vanished into the sun-bleached secretive vaults of a bank in the Cayman Islands. They thought it was a masterstroke. To me, it was the final, damning exhibit. My ally, a ghost in their machine, delivered the packet to me, screenshots, server logs, encrypted transfer orders, all timestamped and irrefutable. It was the frantic, greedy signature on their own confession. I spent the next 48 hours in a state of serene, focused mania. My quiet study became a war room. The evidence was no longer a collection of disparate files. It was a narrative, and I was its author. I printed everything. The voice recording's transcript, with key phrases highlighted in yellow. The ledger from Javier, its columns of numbers looking like a diseased heart's EKG. The bloated invoices from Verdant Impressions. The damning seating chart, each name a potential witness for the prosecution. And now, the real estate documents, the final, flamboyant act of theft. I laid them out on the large mahogany table my late husband had loved, pinning them down with books so they wouldn't curl. I used different colored strings of yarn, like some deranged detective in a film, to connect the players to the shell companies, the shells to the wedding vendors, the vendors back to the offshore account. It was a tapestry of betrayal, woven by my own hands. Seeing it all physically manifested, a sprawling, colorful cancer map of their corruption, made it real in a way the cold light of a screen never could. This wasn't just data. This was the skeleton of their lives, picked clean and laid bare. I could almost smell the chlorine from the Vegas pool party, see the glint of the overpriced floral arrangements. Hear the hollow clink of champagne flutes that were bought with stolen pensions and drained college funds. My phone buzzed. It was my son, Robert. His name flashed on the screen, a little bolt of lightning in the dim room. I let it go to voicemail. A moment later, his cheerful, oblivious voice filled the silence. "Hey, Mom. Just finalizing the seating chart with Cynthia. We've put you at table 12, with the rights. Cynthia's aunt is a hoot. You'll love her. She's a bit deaf, so you won't have to make too much conversation." He laughed, a sound that once filled me with warmth and now felt like shards of glass in my chest. "Can't wait for you to see everything. It's going to be perfect." I looked at the web of yarn, connecting his name to the strategic outreach budget, to the payments for his bespoke tuxedo, to the 5-figure bar tab he'd bragged about. He was living in a gilded bubble, and he had no idea I was holding the pin. I saved the voicemail. It, too, was evidence. Evidence of the beautiful, normal life he thought he was living, a life built on a foundation of his father's and his future father-in-law's rot. The days bled together. A countdown in 2 distinct rhythms. In their world, the tempo was a frantic, joyful presto cake tastings, suit fittings, rehearsal dinners. In my world, it was a slow, deliberate adagio. I perfected my dossier. I wrote a cover letter, not as a mother, but as a whistleblower. It was concise, factual, and devastating. I addressed it to the SEC, the IRS, and the specific investigative journalist at the Wall Street Journal, whose byline I had long respected for its tenacity. The wedding was now 72 hours away. The city was beginning to bloom with the early signs of the event. I saw a billboard near my apartment building, a tasteful minimalist ad for Wright & Sterling's new Green Futures initiative. The hypocrisy was a physical taste, metallic and sour, on my tongue. That night, I packed a single, small suitcase. I didn't know when, or if, I would be able to return to this apartment. Inside, I placed a change of clothes, my passport, and a single framed photograph of my husband. Taken on our honeymoon, his face young and unlined, his eyes clear and honest. Everything else was just furniture. On the eve of the destruction of my family, I slept more soundly than I had in years. There were no more nightmares, no more twisting anxieties. The path was clear, the bill was due, and I, the archivist of their sins, was ready to present it. Let them have their rehearsal dinner. Let them toast to their brilliant future. I was counting down to a detonation, and the venue would be packed with every single person they had ever wanted to impress. The morning of the wedding dawned with a sky of impossible, mocking blue. I dressed with the methodical precision of a soldier preparing for deployment. A simple, elegant navy sheath dress, appropriate for the mother of the groom, yet dark enough to feel like the uniform I'd chosen. I applied my makeup, tracing the lines of a face that had learned to perform serenity. When I looked in the mirror, I saw the archivist, the ghost at the feast, ready to haunt the banquet hall. The city itself seemed to be holding its breath, the air thick with the promise of spectacle. As my town car navigated the streets, I saw the final flourishes being put in place. A banner for the Wright and Sterling nuptials fluttered over the entrance to the museum, the chosen venue. It was a temple of art and history, a place David had always loved, now desecrated by the charade about to unfold within its walls. I thought of my dossier, a digital ghost already haunting the inboxes of powerful men, and the physical package I'd entrusted to a nervous DJ. Two fronts, one war. Inside, the air was a chilled, perfumed hum. The main hall had been transformed into a cathedral of white orchids and white lies. The guest list was a who's who of the financial world, a sea of bespoke suits and calculated smiles. I moved through them like a phantom, my small clutch purse feeling like a lead weight. Every laugh, every clink of a champagne flute was a note in their swan song, though they were all too deaf to hear it. I found Leo near the altar, a stunning figure in his morning coat. His smile was wide, but it didn't reach his eyes, which held a frantic, glazed quality. He was performing his own version of happiness. "Mom," he breathed, pulling me into a hug that felt like clinging to a stranger. "Can you believe it? It's really happening. Everything is perfect." He said it like a mantra, a spell to ward off the truth he must have felt in his bones. I saw Robert then, holding court by a massive ice sculpture, his arms slung around Charles Sterling's shoulders. The two architects of our ruin, beaming with paternal pride. The metallic taste of their hypocrisy flooded my mouth again. I took my seat in the front row, the plush velvet a mockery of comfort. The string quartet began to play, the music a delicate, soaring lie. The guests hushed. The processional started, a slow, beautiful parade of future heartbreak. And then there was Tiffany. She was a vision in heirloom lace, her face radiant with a trust so complete it was a physical pain to witness. She floated down the aisle on her father's arm, her eyes locked on my son. She was walking toward the man she loved, unaware she was stepping directly into the crater I was about to open. They took their places. The officiant began to speak, his voice a sonorous drone about love, honor, and fidelity. I stopped listening. My heart was a metronome counting down the final seconds. My fingers tightened around the small, discreet remote in my purse. It was a cheap, plastic thing, a button that would connect to the DJ's laptop. It felt like the trigger of a bomb. The officiant reached the pivotal moment. If anyone present can show just and legal cause why these two may not be lawfully joined together, let them speak now or forever hold their peace. Then, the massive screen behind the officiant, which had been displaying a soft focus image of the happy couple, flickered. The gentle music cutting off was the first thing people noticed. A few heads turned toward the DJ booth. Then, my file opened. It wasn't a wedding slideshow, it was an indictment. The first image was the clearest, most damning bank statement. The one with the 7-figure transfer from the Green Futures Initiative Fund into a numbered offshore account. The one I'd traced back to a shell company owned by Robert and Charles. The numbers were stark, undeniable, black on white. A soft, confused murmur rippled through the crowd. Robert's head snapped toward the screen. His smile didn't just fade, it shattered. The presentation advanced, automated, relentless. A forged signature, David's, placed neatly beside his father's on a document authorizing the fraudulent transfer. A collective, sharp intake of breath. Then, an email chain. The subject line, Q for investor reallocation. Charles Sterling's email address was clear. His words were colder than the ice sculpture. Asterisk David is on board. He'll handle the authentication. The old fools will never know the difference. Asterisk. He was staring at the screen, his face a canvas of dawning horror. He looked from the evidence to his father, to Charles, then back to the screen. I saw the exact moment his beautiful, normal life cracked open. His shoulders slumped as if the truth were a physical weight crushing him. He looked at Sarah, whose radiance had been replaced by a mask of bewildered terror. Robert Wright was not a man who accepted defeat. He lunged toward the DJ booth, his face a thundercloud of fury. "Turn it off. Kill the power," he roared, his voice cutting through the chaos. But it was too late. The final slide was my simple, elegant chart, a flow chart in calming blues and greens, showing exactly how the money flowed from the pension funds, the small investors, the green advocates, through Wright and Sterling, and directly into their private coffers. At the bottom, in bold, clear type, it read, asterisk, asterisk, the bill is due. Asterisk, asterisk. The Wall Street Journal journalist I'd emailed was already on his phone, speaking rapidly, his eyes fixed on the screen. The presto of their joyful tempo had screeched to a dissonant halt. I stood. I didn't look at Robert, now being physically restrained by a museum security guard. I didn't look at Charles Sterling, who had shrunk into his chair, a deflated balloon of a man. I looked only at my son. His gaze met mine across the wreckage of his wedding. The confusion in his eyes hardened into a devastating, silent understanding. He wasn't looking at his mother anymore. He was looking at the architect of his ruin, the archivist of his sins. He knew I had done this. I turned and walked away, out of the hall of white orchids and broken lives. The sound of the detonation followed me, not an explosion of noise, but a silent, spreading shockwave that would, by day's end, reach every corner of their world. I stepped out into the bright, indifferent afternoon, the ghost who had finally learned to haunt in daylight. The day of the wedding arrived. I had chosen a simple, elegant dress, the most expensive piece of clothing I had ever owned. I had purchased it for this day, not to blend in with their opulence, but as a deliberate act of armor. For years, I had dressed to remain unnoticed, to make myself small in their world. But today demanded a different strategy. Today, I would not be overlooked. The silk was cool and heavy against my skin, a tactile reminder of the weight I was about to wield. And my son Leo stood at the center of it all, the golden boy accepting his crown. I walked into that reception hall not as the embarrassing immigrant mother, but as an executioner. The air was thick with the cloying scent of white orchids and unearned privilege. I could feel the glances, the polite, pitying smiles directed at the woman who had been seated far from the head table, a relic from a past they thought my son had wisely outgrown. I took my hidden position behind the fern, my heart calm and steady. From my leafy blind, I had a perfect, unimpeded view of the dais. I watched my son give his speech, my body perfectly still. He was so polished, so effortlessly charming, his smile a weapon he had learned to wield with surgical precision. He spoke of new beginnings, of legacy, of the bright future he and Sarah would build together. Then his eyes, cold and gleaming, flickered toward my general direction. And of course, he said, the microphone catching the faint, condescending smile, we must thank the people who taught us resilience, who showed us what we had to overcome to get here. I felt no pain, only purpose. It was the final confirmation, the last thread of maternal guilt severed with a clean, sharp cut. He was not my son in that moment. He was Robert Wright's protege, Charles Sterling's heir, a beautiful, hollow vessel for their greed. When he raised his glass for the toast, the crystal, catching the light like 1,000 tiny stars, the room rose with him. It was a painting of perfect, gilded joy. Robert had his hand on Sarah's shoulder, a possessive, triumphant gesture. Charles was beaming, his face flushed with champagne and victory. And my son Alex stood at the center of it all, the golden boy accepting his crown. That was the moment. The peak of their ascent. I met the DJ's eyes across the room. He was a young man with kind eyes, who I'd paid in cash from the small, secret fund I'd been building for a year, telling him it was for a surprise anniversary video for my son. I saw the question in his gaze, the last chance for me to back away. I gave a slow, deliberate nod. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The toast hung in the air, a suspended, crystalline moment, then the massive screen behind the bridal party, which had been cycling through curated, soft-focus photos of the happy couple, flickered and went black. A few people chuckled, assuming a technical glitch. Robert's head tilted slightly, a flicker of annoyance crossing his features. Then, the first document appeared. It wasn't a photo, it was a scanned internal memo from Wright and Sterling, its header stark and official. The DJ, bless him, had killed the music. The sudden silence was more deafening than any noise. Someone near the front, with better eyesight, gasped. Robert squinted at the screen, his smile frozen, then melting into confusion. The memo detailed the first pension fund, the one for the city sanitation workers, and the proposed fee structure that would siphon over 40% of its value into a shadow subsidiary. The room began to murmur, a low, confused hive. Robert's head snapped toward the DJ booth. "What is this?" he barked, his voice cutting through the unease. But it was too late to stop the avalanche. Slide after slide materialized between Charles and a shell company director, falsified sustainability reports, the personal financial statements showing the transfers. The purchases of villas and yachts that corresponded exactly with the miscellaneous administrative costs deducted from widows' accounts. I stood perfectly still behind my fern, watching the truth become a physical weight crushing them. I looked at Sarah, whose radiance had been replaced by a mask of bewildered terror as she stared at the proof of the foundation her future was built upon. Robert Wright was not a man who accepted defeat. He lunged toward the DJ booth, his face a thundercloud of fury. "Turn it off, kill the power," he roared, his voice a raw animal sound that tore through the civilized veneer of the room. But it was too late. The final slide was my simple, elegant chart. A flowchart in calming blues and greens, showing exactly how the money flowed from the pension funds, the small investors, the green advocates, through Wright and Sterling, and directly into their private coffers. The lines were clean, the arrows definitive. It was a map of a robbery. At the bottom, in bold clear type, it read, ***, the bill is due. ***, not in cheers or applause, but in a chaos of shouting, of chairs scraping back, of camera phones being raised, their flashes popping like a new, frantic kind of lightning. I saw the Wall Street Journal journalist I'd emailed, standing in the corner, already on his phone, speaking rapidly. His eyes fixed on the screen, a predator who had just spotted wounded prey. The presto of their joyful tempo had screeched to a dissonant halt. I didn't look at Robert, now being physically restrained by a museum security guard, his shouts muffled. I didn't look at Charles Sterling, who had shrunk into his chair, a deflated balloon of a man, his face ashen. I looked only at my son. His glass was still in his hand, forgotten, suspended in midair. His gaze met mine across the wreckage of his wedding. I saw the journey in his eyes, first confusion, then dawning horror, then a flicker of desperate denial, and finally, a hardening into a devastating, silent understanding. He saw the woman behind the fern, the archivist, the quiet, overlooked mother who had spent a lifetime observing, remembering, and connecting the dots everyone else ignored. He wasn't looking at his mother anymore. He was looking at the architect of his ruin, the archivist of his sins. He knew I had done this. I held his gaze for a second longer, long enough for the knowledge to settle, to become an unchangeable part of his history. Then I turned and walked away, out of the hall of white orchids and broken lives. No one tried to stop me. I was a ghost moving through the panicked crowd, invisible now for an entirely different reason. The sound of the detonation followed me, not an explosion of noise, but a silent, spreading shockwave that would, by day's end, reach every corner of their world. I stepped out into the bright, indifferent afternoon, the sun warm on my skin, the city humming its ordinary song. I was the ghost who had finally learned to haunt in daylight, and the quiet that settled inside me was not emptiness, but peace. As the DJ's voice cut through the applause and the giant screen flickered to life, I watched my son's triumphant smile curdle into irritation. He scanned the room, no doubt searching for the technician who had dared interrupt his perfect moment. A cold, sharp satisfaction settled within me. He was so focused on the imagined glitch, he didn't comprehend that it was the prelude to the collapse of his meticulously constructed life. The first image was a masterpiece of curation. It was a scan of a faded, thermal-printed receipt from the Gingerman pub, dated 15 years ago, a circled item for a single pint of lager, paid for with my credit card. A mundane slip of paper, but beneath it I had placed a photograph. Leo, his face young and unlined, his arms slung around the shoulders of a boy I knew to be Jamie Miller. They were both laughing, their eyes bright with a shared secret. The caption, in my own clean archival script, read, "The day you told me Robert abandoned you. Your foundation myth, you called it, the lie you built your life upon." Leo's brow furrowed, his irritation sharpening into something uglier, more defensive. He took a half-step toward the DJ's booth, a king ready to have a nuisance removed. But then the screen changed. This one was a screenshot of a bank transfer. A staggering sum moving from an account I had long forgotten, custodial account from my own inheritance, into one held by Robert T. Sterling. The date was 2 days after Leo's 21st birthday. The caption, "the first payment. For services not rendered. For a silence you demanded he keep." A series of emails painstakingly recovered from an old laptop I'd supposedly recycled. Leo, writing to Robert, "She's getting suspicious. The poor abandoned son narrative is wearing thin. We need another payment. Make it look like a loan." Robert's reply, cold and corporate. "The emotional blackmail surcharge is getting expensive. Leo, this is the last one. Whispers turned into gasps. Cameras, meant to capture the happy couple, were now pointed at the screen, at Leo's crumbling face, at Robert's frantic denials. Then came the final, elegant twist of the knife. Not a document, but a video. Grainy, dark, shot from the security camera of my own study. It showed Leo, just 6 months ago, letting himself in with his key. He moved with a thief's confidence, going straight to my desk. The angle was perfect, capturing him opening a locked drawer with a key he'd had copied, and removing the very folder that contained the first traces of my suspicion-old photos. A copy of his birth certificate, a letter from a private investigator I'd hired and then, in a moment of weakness, dismissed. He thought he was erasing his tracks. He was, in fact, creating the most damning evidence of all. The screen froze on his face as he looked up directly into the hidden lens, a ghost of a smug smile on his lips. The caption was simple, final. "The archivist's file. The one you tried to steal. She did this. She's insane. A jealous, lonely old woman." He was a deflated balloon of a man, his entire world this lucrative alliance. This carefully constructed dynasty popping in front of 300 witnesses, but I saw none of it. Not really. My world had narrowed to a single point. My son. His glass was still in his hand, forgotten, suspended in mid-air between the table and his lips. The charming facade had been utterly scraped away, leaving behind raw, unvarnished truth. His gaze met mine across the wreckage of his wedding. The distance between us now, an unbridgeable chasm of my making. I saw the journey in his eyes, first confusion, then dawning horror as the pieces of his life were publicly dissected. Then, a flicker of desperate denial, a child's hope that his mother would swoop in and say it was all a terrible mistake. And finally, a hardening into a devastating, silent understanding. He saw the woman behind the fern, the archivist, the quiet, overlooked mother who had spent a lifetime observing, remembering, and connecting the dots everyone else ignored. He wasn't looking at his mother anymore. He was looking at the architect of his ruin, the curator of his sins. He knew I had done this. I held his gaze for a second longer, long enough for the knowledge to settle, to become an unchangeable, public fact of his history. It was my final exhibit. Then I turned and walked away, out of the hall of white orchids and broken lives. No one tried to stop me. I was a ghost, moving through the panicked crowd, invisible now for an entirely different reason. The sound of the detonation followed me, not an explosion of noise, but a silent, spreading shockwave that would, by day's end, reach every corner of their world. I stepped out into the bright, indifferent afternoon, the sun warm on my skin, the city humming its ordinary song. I was the ghost who had finally learned to haunt in daylight. And the quiet that settled inside me was not emptiness, but peace. The screen flickered, and instead of baby pictures, the first slide appeared, a bank statement from an offshore account in the Cayman Islands, with Leo's name and signature clearly visible. A collective gasp went through the room, a sharp, percussive intake of 200 breaths that sucked all the air out of the hall. The next slide showed an email from Tiffany's father to my son, with the subject line covering our tracks. It felt like a key sliding into a lock I had spent a lifetime forging. In a clear, steady voice, with the accent my son despised, I began to speak. My son talked about his dreams, I said, my voice echoing through the stunned silence. It was not the voice of a quiet mother. It was the voice of La Calculadora. And it was time to present the final tally. But he forgot to mention how they were paid for. A series of text messages with a city official arranging favorable zoning laws in exchange for future considerations. Click. A photograph of the original, handwritten ledger from his father's modest hardware store, a relic of the honest work Leo found so embarrassingly quaint, juxtaposed with the dizzying digital figures of his embezzlement. I did not shout. I did not weep. I simply connected the dots, the same dots I had been connecting for years, in the quiet of my study, surrounded by the scent of old paper and the weight of my husband's disappointed ghost. I spoke of the small investors he had ruined, the elderly couples whose pensions were tied up in his sure-thing developments that were nothing but houses of cards. I named names, not out of malice, but out of a profound, bone-deep need for the record to be complete. The room was a tapestry of reactions, each face a frozen study in shock. Tiffany's mother had a hand pressed to her throat, her diamonds cutting into her skin. Her father, the great self-made man, had shrunk in his chair, his complexion a sickly gray. But my focus, my entire universe, narrowed to a single point. My son. His glass was still in his hand, forgotten, suspended in midair between the table and his lips. The charming facade had been utterly scraped away, leaving behind raw, unvarnished truth. His gaze met mine across the wreckage of his wedding. The distance between us now, an unbridgeable chasm of my making. I saw the journey in his eyes, first confusion, then dawning horror, as the pieces of his life were publicly dissected. Then, a flicker of desperate denial, a child's hope that his mother would swoop in and say it was all a terrible mistake. And finally, a hardening into a devastating, silent understanding. He saw the woman behind the fern, the archivist, the quiet, overlooked mother who had spent a lifetime observing, remembering, and connecting the dots everyone else ignored. He wasn't looking at his mother anymore. He was looking at the architect of his ruin, the curator of his sins. He knew I had done this. I held his gaze for a second longer, long enough for the knowledge to settle, to become an unchangeable public fact of his history. It was my final exhibit. Then I turned and walked away, out of the hall of white orchids and broken lives. No one tried to stop me. I was a ghost moving through the panicked crowd, invisible now for an entirely different reason. A woman in a pink dress was sobbing quietly into her napkin. A man was frantically tapping on his phone, no doubt alerting his broker. I walked through them all, untouched. The sound of the detonation followed, made not an explosion of noise, but a silent, spreading shockwave that would, by day's end, reach every corner of their world. I stepped out into the bright, indifferent afternoon, the sun warm on my skin, the city humming its ordinary song. A taxi blared its horn. A teenager laughed into her phone. The world continued, blissfully unaware of the small, contained earthquake I had just triggered. I walked to the corner bus stop, the one I'd taken to get here, and sat on the familiar, sun-warmed plastic bench. I opened my simple cloth bag and took out my husband's old, worn pocket watch. He had left it to me, not to Leo. He'd always known the metal of our son's character. I clicked it open, right on time. The bus arrived with a hydraulic sigh. I climbed aboard, paid my fare, and took a seat by the window. As it pulled away from the curb, I saw the first news van screech to a halt in front of the hotel, a predator drawn to the scent of fresh carrion. I felt nothing, no triumph, no sorrow, just a vast, quiet expanse of finality. I was the ghost who had finally learned to haunt in daylight, and the quiet that settled inside me was not emptiness, but peace. It was the peace of a balanced ledger, of a story finally told in full. It was the peace of a woman who had, after a lifetime of being background noise, finally spoken her truth. And as the bus carried me away from the world of offshore accounts and white orchids, back to my small apartment with its books and its memories, I knew it was a peace I had earned. The ghost was no longer haunting the halls of other people's lives. She was, at last, going home. The final move was absolute. As I finished speaking, two plainclothes detectives I had summoned an hour earlier entered the ballroom. Leo's face turned to ash, a mask of pure, horrified disbelief, while Tiffany dissolved into sobs, her fairy tale wedding unraveling around her. Her father stood frozen, his mouth agape, exposed as a common thief before his high society peers. In that moment, he finally saw Minot as a simple cleaner, but as the architect of his ruin. I had used their own arrogance to orchestrate their downfall, forcing them to expose themselves in the most public and humiliating way possible. The silence that followed my final, quiet word was a physical thing, thick and heavy, broken only by Tiffany's ragged breaths. Then chaos erupted. Not the loud, explosive kind, but the cold, efficient kind. The detectives, a man and a woman with weary, professional eyes, moved through the crowd with the grim purpose of coroners. They didn't need to shout. They went straight to Arthur, Tiffany's father, and my son. Leo found his voice then, a strangled, "Mother, what have you done?" It wasn't a plea for understanding, but an accusation. It was the final confirmation I needed. He wasn't shocked by the crime, but by the consequence. I met his gaze, and for a fleeting second, I saw the little boy who used to hide behind my skirts during thunderstorms. But the man had eclipsed the boy long ago, and all that remained was the cold calculation in his eyes, now clouded with panic. Arthur, however, was a different animal. His shock melted into a boiling, purple-faced rage. "This is preposterous," he boomed, his voice echoing in the vaulted ceiling. "You have no proof. This is the ranting of a jealous, delusional old woman." He pointed a trembling, manicured finger at me. "She's the cleaner, for God's sake." I hadn't just given the police the files my husband had secretly compiled. I had given them a roadmap, a script for this very moment. The trap wasn't just sprung. They had walked into it, smiling for the cameras. As the detectives began the formal process, reading them their rights in a monotone that was somehow more damning than any shouted accusation, I turned away. My work was done. I walked towards the ballroom's grand exit, my sensible shoes silent on the polished marble. A sea of stunned, glittering faces parted for me. They were a gallery of open mouths and wide eyes, their champagne flutes frozen halfway to their lips. I was no longer invisible. I was a force of nature, and they were merely debris in my wake. I stepped out into the bright, indifferent afternoon, the sun warm on my skin, the city humming its ordinary song. A taxi blared its horn. A teenager laughed into her phone. The world continued, blissfully unaware of the small, contained earthquake I had just triggered. I walked to the corner bus stop, the one I'd taken to get here, and sat on the familiar, sun-warmed plastic bench. I opened my simple cloth bag and took out my husband's old, worn pocket watch. He had left it to me, not to Leo. He'd known. He'd always known the metal of our son's character. I clicked it open, right on time. The bus arrived with a hydraulic sigh. I climbed aboard, paid my fare, and took a seat by the window. As it pulled away from the curb, I saw the first news van screech to a halt in front of the hotel, a predator drawn to the scent of fresh carrion. I felt nothing. No triumph, no sorrow. Just a vast, quiet expanse of finality. The bus rumbled through the city, moving from the world of gleaming steel and glass to the familiar slightly worn streets of my neighborhood. I watched the cityscape soften, the sharp edges giving way to the gentle decay of old brick buildings and the vibrant, messy life of corner markets and towering oak trees. With every block, a layer of tension I had carried for decades, a weight so constant I had forgotten it was there, began to dissolve. I was the ghost who had finally learned to haunt in daylight. And the quiet that settled inside me was not emptiness, but peace. It was the peace of a balanced ledger, of a story finally told in full. It was the peace of a woman who had, after a lifetime of being background noise, finally spoken her truth. The bus stopped a block from my apartment. The walk was different now. The air smelled of blooming jasmine from a neighbor's fence, and the dappled sunlight through the leaves felt like a benediction. I climbed the stairs to my second-floor home, the worn wood of the steps a comfort under my feet. Inside, the silence was different, too. It wasn't the silence of loneliness, but of contentment. My books waited on their shelves, their spines a mosaic of comfort. The photograph of my husband, a younger, brighter version of the man I'd nursed through his final, worried days, sat on the mantelpiece. He was smiling. I think he knew, somehow, that I would find the strength. That I would be the keeper of his truth, and my own daye. Put the kettle on for tea, the ritual as grounding as prayer. As I waited for the water to boil, I stood by the window, looking out at the quiet street. Children were playing, their shouts a joyful, distant music. An old man was watering his roses. Life, simple and unpretentious, went on. And as the bus had carried me away from the world of offshore accounts and white orchids, back to my small apartment with its books and its memories, I knew it was a peace I had earned. The ghost was no longer haunting the halls of other people's lives. She was, at last, going home. The whistle of the kettle sang through the small kitchen, a sound of pure, uncomplicated promise. I poured the water, the steam warming my face, and I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I was finally, completely, free. From my point of view, justice was not the flashing lights of the police cars or the panicked whispers that filled the room. It was the look in my son's eyes. It was the moment he finally understood that the woman he had dismissed, the immigrant mother he was so ashamed of, was the person who held all the power. He and his father-in-law were led away. The guests, his dream family, melted away, not wanting to be associated with the scandal. The beautiful wedding, paid for by my sacrifice, was now nothing more than an empty, silent monument to his greed. I stood there for a long time, a solitary figure amidst the ruins of the reception. The white orchids, so pristine and cold just an hour before, now seemed to wilt in their vases, their perfection revealed as a fragile, temporary state. A single petal drifted down and landed on the tablecloth next to a half-eaten slice of cake, a tiny, white surrender. The string quartet had long since packed up their instruments, their final, elegant notes replaced by the hollow echo of my own heels on the marble floor as I prepared to leave. No one approached me. I was an island in that sea of discarded chairs and abandoned champagne flutes. The mother of the groom, the ghost, but I was no longer haunting them. They were now haunted by me. By the truth I had carried, a weight I had finally set down right in the center of their beautiful, hollow world. I walked out of the Grand Hotel ballroom, through the opulent lobby where I had once felt so small, and out into the cooling evening air. I did not look back. The bus ride home was a liminal space, a quiet tunnel between the two worlds I had inhabited. I watched the city lights blur past the window, each one a tiny, distant sun in a universe I was no longer trying to navigate. The confrontation had not been a explosion of anger, but a calm, surgical severing. I had not raised my voice. I had simply presented the facts. The documents I had safeguarded for so long, the proof of the embezzlement, the offshore account numbers my husband had whispered to me on his deathbed, a secret he was too weakened by illness to ever confront himself. I had given my son every opportunity to do the right thing, to choose his mother over his father-in-law's corrupt empire. His choice, to shun me and embrace that gilded life, was his own. And tonight, he was living the consequence. The peace I felt was not vindictive. It was heavier than that, more profound. It was the peace of a debt finally paid, a promise finally kept. I had been my husband's keeper, just as I had vowed. I had protected his legacy from being tarnished by the very man who should have honored it. And in doing so, I had become the keeper of my own truth, the architect of my own freedom. The bus stopped a block from my apartment. The walk was different now. The air smelled of blooming jasmine from a neighbor's fence, and the dappled moonlight through the leaves felt like a benediction. I climbed the stairs to my second-floor home, the worn wood of the steps a comfort under my feet, each creak a familiar greeting. Inside, the silence was different too. It wasn't the silence of loneliness, but of contentment. My books waited on their shelves, their spines a mosaic of comfort and lives lived beyond these four walls. The photograph of my husband, a younger, brighter version of the man I'd nursed through his final, worried days, sat on the mantelpiece. He was smiling. I think he knew, somehow, that I would find the strength, that I would be the keeper of his truth and my own. Tonight, I looked at his face and felt not the sharp sting of grief, but a warm, steadying presence. The job was done. I put the kettle on for tea, the ritual as grounding as prayer. As I waited for the water to boil, I stood by the window, looking out at the quiet street. The children were gone, called in for the night, but the echo of their games seemed to linger in the air. The old man's roses were closed for the night, tight-fisted buds holding their scent until morning. Life, simple and unpretentious, went on. My life. And as the bus had carried me away from the world of offshore accounts and white orchids, back to my small apartment with its books and its memories, I knew it was a peace I had earned. The ghost was no longer haunting the halls of other people's lives. She was, at last, going home. The whistle of the kettle sang through the small kitchen, a sound of pure, uncomplicated promise. I poured the water over the chamomile leaves, the steam warming my face, a gentle caress. I carried my cup to my armchair, the one by the reading lamp with the faded floral pattern. I did not turn on the television for noise. I did not pick up a book to escape. I simply sat, cradling the warmth in my hands, and let the stillness settle around me. It was a fertile stillness, full of potential, not emptiness. For the first time in years, my future was a blank page, not a predetermined sentence. There were no more battles to fight, no more secrets to keep, no more apologies to make for who I was. I took a sip of tea, the delicate flavor blooming on my tongue. I thought of my son, not with bitterness, but with a distant, aching pity. He was in a cold, sterile interrogation room while I was here, surrounded by the warmth of my own hard-won life. He had all the money in the world, but he had lost his compass. I had very little, but I had my integrity, my memories, and this profound, unshakable quiet. The phone did not ring. I did not expect it to. The cord had been cut, not with a scream, but with a quiet, resolute truth. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones as I sat in the pool of lamplight in my quiet apartment, that I was finally, completely free. The story was over, and mine was just beginning. I didn't stay to watch the rest. I walked out of that hall, the wreckage of my son's life receding behind me, and felt neither triumph nor sadness, but a profound quiet. This was not the hollow silence I had filled for decades with the clatter of dishes or the drone of a television. This was a dense, living quiet, like the moment just before a seed breaks open underground. Back in my small, clean house, I made tea and opened my old ledger. La Calculadora had done her job. The mother had finally let go. The peace I settled into was my own, bought and paid for, not just Leo's immigrant mother, but a woman who had been underestimated and who had, in the end, reclaimed her dignity and her name. The ledger lay open on my kitchen table, its pages a mosaic of my past life. Columns of figures, dates, and initials in my tight, efficient script. It wasn't just a record of debts collected and favors owed. It was a map of a survival I had meticulously engineered. My finger traced a line from 10 years ago, a payment to a man named Salazar for information services. That information had saved a young woman from a predatory loan shark. A fact Leo never knew. He only saw the cold arithmetic, the ledger, as a weapon. He never understood it was also a shield. For me, for others like us, navigating the jagged edges of a system not built for us. I was not a saint, no, but I was a force of balance. I closed the book. Its work, like mine as La Calculadora, was complete. It could become an artifact now, a relic for a museum of my own making. I carried my tea to the armchair, the one with the faded floral pattern that held the shape of my body like a faithful friend. The whistle of the kettle had been a sound of pure, uncomplicated promise, and now the steam from my cup rose, a gentle caress against my face. I did not turn on the television for noise. I did not pick up a book to escape. I simply sat, cradling the warmth in my hands, and let the stillness settle around me. It was a fertile stillness, full of potential, not emptiness. For the first time in years, my future was a blank page, not a predetermined sentence. There were no more battles to fight, no more secrets to keep, no more apologies to make for who I was. I took a sip, the delicate flavor of chamomile blooming on my tongue. I thought of my son, not with the old, familiar bitterness that used to coat my throat like bile, but with a distant, aching pity. He was in a cold, sterile interrogation room, the walls closing in, while I was here, surrounded by the warmth of my own hard-won life. He had all the money in the world, but he had lost his compass, trading his soul for the hollow ring of a stock market bell. I had very little, but I had my integrity, my memories, and this profound, unshakable quiet. The scales, which had felt so unbalanced for so long, had finally been reset. The phone did not ring. I did not expect it to. The cord had been cut, not with a scream, but with a quiet, resolute truth. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones as I sat in the pool of lamplight in my quiet apartment, that I was finally, completely free. The story of La Calculadora and her ungrateful son was over, and mine was just beginning. Outside my window, the city lights began to flicker on, one by one, like distant stars. I watched a neighbor across the street water her geraniums, her movements slow and deliberate. I saw a young couple walking a dog, laughing about something. These were not scenes from a life I was shut out of. They were simply lives, and I was in one, too, my own. The ghost was no longer haunting the halls of other people's lives. She was, at last, going home. A thought, unbidden and light, drifted into my mind. I had always wanted to learn how to paint, not to be good, but to feel the smear of color on a canvas, to make a mess that belonged to no one but me. Leo would have scoffed, called it a frivolous waste of time for a woman my age. But his voice was a faint echo now, losing its power with every passing second of this blessed silence. The idea didn't frighten me with its vagueness. It excited me. It was a question mark, and for once I didn't need an immediate answer. I finished my tea, the cup now cool in my hands. The warmth had moved from the porcelain to my core. I stood up and walked to the window, placing my palms flat on the cool glass. My reflection looked back at me, an older woman, her face lined with stories, but her eyes were clear. They were my eyes again, not the wary, calculating eyes of a debt collector or the pleading, sorrowful eyes of a rejected mother. They were just mine. I smiled at her, a small, private thing. The story was over, and in the quiet of that ending, I could finally hear the whisper of the next one waiting to begin. It sounded like peace. It sounded like mine.